Hey, hey, hey! My name's Helene the Scripted, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Chapter 8 of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. Now the trigger warnings make sense. Talking of trigger warnings, here they are before I get into the chapter. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers if you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to one of my other videos, such as the Adro series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 8. Take your protein pills. The scattered splotches of dried cement crunched under Daichi's feet as he walked slowly towards the open doorway of the building. The sun was still out, but it fell slowly over the skyline, making it seem like the golden light was washing away the dirty grey of the cinder blocks and revealing a warm honey yellow beneath. The building was tall, and Daichi didn't know much about construction, but it looked like it was right on track to be finished. The foundations and the metal support beams were all in place, but the bricks stopped filling in the gaps between them after the first floor. Stepping over some brown weeds, Daichi realized how quiet Awaizumi was, but he supposed anything would be quiet compared to the slapping of his sneakers on the asphalt only moments ago. He looked panicked, though, like a tiny chihuahua darting its head from side to side, shivering all over. It was weird seeing someone so strong look like that. Daichi had always thought that Awaizumi was something like a bulldozer, impenetrable, indestructible, capable of handling anything that got in its way. But since Daichi arrived at his apartment earlier that day, he'd been like a live wire. It seemed like a sort of sadness shot through his nerves, making him jolt and twitch like he was waiting for the worst thing possible to happen. In a way, he was, Daichi reasoned. This seemed like the last straw. If nothing came of this, Daichi doubted he'd be able to convince Awaizumi to help so easily again. All of his hopes seemed to be riding on the stack of rocks towering over them. A sound from behind the wall made Daichi jolt back a step, causing him to collide with Awaizumi's chest. Awaizumi made a shush noise, his eyes wide, and Daichi watched his trembling index finger press against his frown. Awaizumi sidestepped him, and waited with his left ear pointed to the opening of the building. The fists that hung down by his hips clenched so tightly Daichi was surprised his veins didn't pop. Another rustle, accompanied by a cough. Daichi's heart was in his throat. The cough was deep. It was almost definitely a clearing tobacco tar out of his lungs kind, not the sick kind. But most importantly, it sounded nothing like Oikawa, too scratchy and deep, the type that usually accompanied yellow-stained white beards and creased, aging eyes. Neither of which Daichi associated with the ambitious volleyball rival from his high school days. But Daichi would have never associated Oikawa with running away and telling no one either. Sure, he had been dramatic and over-exaggerated the shit talk from the other side of the net, but this case was another level. So he really felt like he had no place to associate Oikawa with anything, because he clearly didn't know enough about him. He wasn't sure if Awaizumi realized that it sounded nothing like Oikawa either. Daichi really couldn't be sure because he was creeping towards the opening, his finger still raised to his lips, as if Daichi wasn't as quiet as he could possibly be. After a moment too long of silence, Daichi cleared his throat, and almost counted down from 3 before he started speaking. "Hello?" he called out, and then tilted his head closer to the doorway to listen for a reply. The coughing on the other side of the wall stopped. "Hello?" a raspy voice repeated. Awaizmi's head reeled back like he was in a moving car that stopped way too quickly. He looked back at Daichi with a grimace. "That's not Oikawa," he whispered, and Daichi pushed a breath out of his pursed lips. "I know," he mouthed back, and moved in front of Awaizmi towards the door. "Can we come in?" he asked out loud, and then winced at his own question. It wasn't like this man owned this place. They were all trespassers, all breaking the law to be surrounded by graffiti-riddled walls and overgrown ivy invading every surface. The voice huffed out what seemed to be an amused breath of air. "Sure, Mom." He sounded much younger with a sharp thrill of laughter ringing in his voice. And suddenly Daichi was moving forward over the dusty threshold. "No way!" Startled by the yell, Daichi turned his head to the left and looked at the young man who was sitting against the stone wall between two large, dirty puddles of water and smoking a halfway gone, hand-rolled cigarette. "You're the captain of Kurasano, right?" Daichi looked back at Awaizmi. He stood about 3 paces away, mouth agape and eyebrows furrowed. "You know this guy?" he asked. He pointed to the man on the floor. Despite it being summer, and not nearly as cold as it could have been, the young man's brown hair was flattened by a black beanie. "No idea," Daichi said, and the guy put a cigarette between his lips, so loosely that Daichi expected it to fall, and now placed his free hand against his knee. "You wound me, Captain San," he said, and his eyes darted upwards to the hole in the floor above their heads that revealed the pink-tinted sky. He looked back at Daichi with a wide grin. "Higashiyama Katsumichi?" He took the cigarette between his fingers and shot them a lazy peace sign with it. "I was an outside hitter on the Jozenji team. We played against each other in 2012? Daichi shrugged. "Sounds about right," he said. "Anyone else around?" Higashiyama looked from left to right, his grin brightening. "Not that I could see." Awaizmi stepped closer to Daichi, with shoulders tense. "We're not here to fuck around, kid." Higashiyama snorted and inhaled a long drag from his cigarette. "Kid?" He tried to blow the smoke in Awaizmi's face, but he was sitting too far away for it to actually reach. "You're barely a year older than me, and anyways, aren't you a cop? Are you here to arrest someone?" He pointed at Daichi and took another drag. "How'd you know that?" Daichi asked. He was wearing his uniform, but he put a sweater over anything distinguishable. "I've seen you around a bit." Higashiyama shrugged. "So are you here to arrest someone?" Daichi eyed him, snuffing out his cigarette in the puddle next to him. He caught Higashiyama's eye, and he smiled when he said, "Don't worry, boss." He took a plastic bag out of his pocket and dropped the butt of it in it. "Nothing illegal to see here." He slipped it back into his pocket and in its place took out a bag of loose tobacco, some rolling papers, a filter, and a box of matches. "Just some casual trespassing," Daichi said, and watched him assemble another cigarette. He didn't mention that he and Awaizmi were also committing the same crime, because he didn't want to lose the little leverage he had over Higashiyama. Not that there was much to begin with. "We're actually here looking for someone else." Higashiyama popped the new cigarette between his lips and lit it up. "Oh yeah?" His voice was muffled as he cupped his free hand around the flame and took a small puff when it lit. "Lots of people pass in and out here." Awaizmi took out his phone. His thumbs flew across the screen for a second, before he turned it around, showing Higashiyama whatever was on it. "You seen him around?" Higashiyama stared at the picture of Oikawa that Awaizmi was presumably showing him, his face blank, which was an unusual sight to take in after being assaulted by his cheeky grin since they began speaking to him. "Sure have." He leaned a little closer to Awaizmi's phone. Not lately, though. Daichi and Awaizmi shared a look. It wasn't quite an excited look, but Daichi saw his own urgency reflected back at him in Awaizmi's face. After a shared beat of silence, they simultaneously looked back at Higashiyama. Awaizmi crouched down, leaning most of his weight on the balls of his feet. When? Do you know where he's been since you last saw him? Higashiyama was silent for a moment. I saw him around when I first started coming here, he said, but that was years ago. He hasn't been around in a long time. And what exactly do you come here to do? Daichi asked, because he was curious. Higashiyama didn't look like he lived in an abandoned building, but he was slowly learning not everyone was as they appeared to be. I used to come here to smoke, he shrugged. A lot of delinquents come here too, sometimes the odd squatter. Some people just come here to hang out. He took another drag, and Daichi watched the smoke pour slowly out of his nose. I know a few kids who like to use the support beams over there as some kind of ramp for their bikes. He gestured to some elevated large beams of metal on the far side of the rundown room. They seemed to be hanging on by the last threads of life. Clearly, they were used most often. And you've seen him here? Awaizmi tapped the screen of his phone. Higashiyama nodded. We never talked much, though. He was on friendlier terms with Teru. Daichi's eyes widened a little at that. Terashima Yuji? Awaizmi looked up at him, his mouth opened like he was probably going to ask something. Probably. Who? That's the guy! Higashiyama pointed his cigarette at the air in front of him. They were buddies when Oikawa was around. I think he might have done the odd job with Teru too. If there's anyone who'll still be in contact with your boyfriend, it's him. Daichi's throat made a tiny click noise when he swallowed. He expected Awaizmi to correct Higashiyama and tell him that Oikawa hadn't been his boyfriend, but he didn't. Maybe because Awaizmi wanted it to be true. Or maybe because all he heard was that someone might still be in contact with Oikawa. Maybe it was because they were getting closer and he didn't care about anything else. Can we have his number? Daichi asked. Higashiyama sucked in some more smoke. No can do, police officer-san, he shrugged. Why the fuck not? Awaizmi demanded, and Daichi nudged him with his foot because he was so fragile at the moment that Daichi was worried if he got too worked up, he'd snap into a million pieces, and he'd never be able to put him back together again. I don't think he'd like it very much if I gave a random police officer his number, he said, but he usually hangs around on Wednesday afternoon, so come back then and see if you can catch him. Awaizmi stood back up and shrugged at Daichi. I'm free if you are, he said. Daichi smiled. Not only were they getting closer, Awaizmi was still on board. He'd been a little worried that once they didn't find Oikawa in the sports center, Awaizmi would decide he'd had enough. Works for me, he agreed. When they were back in the car, Daichi hesitated before he started up the engine. Did you really think we were going to find him there? He asked. The sky had turned dark while they were talking to Higashiyama, and Daichi could see Awaizmi's frown reflected in the windows because of the overhead light. No, I knew it was unlikely, but I wanted him to be there. His voice cracked, and Daichi took his hand off the key in the ignition to turn and look at him properly. His voice came out shaky. I wanted him to be there so badly. Daichi wasn't sure what to do when Awaizmi's face crumpled into a grimace and then tears began to fall. Trying not to think about it, Daichi put his hand over Awaizmi's bicep and patted it. Hey, we're meeting up with Terashima on Wednesday. We're almost there. Awaizmi put the heels of his hands against his eyes and rubbed angrily at them. making them a lot more bloodshot than they had been, and he made a frustrated noise. "Shit, I'm so sorry," he said, and dropped his hands into his lap with an aggressive sniff. "I didn't mean to start crying." Daichi gripped Awaizmi's hoodie and pulled him over the center console. He squeezed the fabric of the back of his hoodie between his fingers and tightened his arms around Awaizmi in the most awkward hug he'd ever been a part of. "You don't need to be sorry for having feelings," he said, and relaxed a little into the embrace when Awaizmi's hands wrapped just as tightly around his waist. "If I was in your position, I think I'd be a lot worse." Awaizmi sniffed into Daichi's shoulder, and he tried not to grimace at the dampness that he was beginning to feel through his sweatshirt. "This is so embarrassing," Awaizmi muttered, but he still hung on a little tighter. It had started to feel a lot more like some sort of pro wrestling move than a hug. It felt like Awaizmi was trying to squeeze the soul straight out of Daichi's body. But he didn't let go. From what he gathered, Awaizmi didn't have anyone else to hug. Hanamaki and Matsukawa had talked to Awaizmi like they hadn't seen him in a long time, and he never spoke about any other friends. In that way, they were similar. Daichi had Kyoko and Tanaka, and sometimes Asahi, but before Suga came back into his life, he only had himself. It was a lot lonelier now that he had something to compare it to. So he let his chin rest in the dip where Awaizmi's shoulder met his neck. He cried a little less, but the dampness on Daichi's sweatshirt grew slowly as the time around them passed, and Daichi found that it wasn't as gross as it had been a few moments before. Daichi sort of felt like a teenage girl being interrogated by his parents about his first boyfriend. Kyoko and Tanaka sat across from him at his kitchen table, sharing not-so-secret glances at each other with raised eyebrows. "What's with the looks?" he asked after the 4th time they both pressed their lips together to hide smiles. "Nothing," Tanaka said, and coughed into his hand when his lips started to curl up into the beginnings of a smile. "Just, you're talking an awful lot about Suga." Daichi stared at him for a second too long. It was the stare that usually made him wriggle in his seat, but apparently his amusement won out over his discomfort, because he just stared back with a teasing look. "Well, we are working on Oikawa's case together," he said, "and that takes up pretty much all of my time. What else am I supposed to talk about?" "You're working with Awaizmi too," Kyoko pointed out. "But we haven't heard much about him." Daichi sighed like the questions were annoying. If he was being honest, Suga was a conversation topic he didn't mind talking about, even if he was being grilled by his friends about him. It was easy to talk about him, and he liked to do it. He liked telling Kyoko about the small details, like how Suga had come back to get the clothes he'd left at Daichi's house earlier that morning, and bought his favourite brand of instant coffee for the next time he stayed over. How he talked proudly about the kids in his class like he had been the one to rear them. Or how he teased Daichi about owning a Celine Dion CD, because who even has CDs nowadays? And Celine Dion, really? "I'm talking about him because you know Suga," he reasoned. "Awaizmi is sort of irrelevant to you guys." "It's not because you have a big fat crush on him?" Tanaka asked. Daichi slapped his buzzed head. "No, it's not." Tanaka snickered when he lifted his head back up. "You're not denying it." "That's because there's nothing to deny." He picked up a piece of shrimp tempura and popped it into his mouth with his chopsticks. Kyoko and Tanaka watched him chew his food. He bit his lip to stop them from spreading into a smile. "Awaizmi thinks I should ask him out." "You should." Kyoko pushed her glasses up her nose with a sort of elegance that Daichi didn't think belonged in his tiny kitchen, but that sort of summarized Kyoko as a whole. Unnecessarily graceful, but in a way that she seemed oblivious to. Looking at her sitting in his house every week was like looking at the Mona Lisa beside a bunch of stick figures drawn by 5-year-olds. "You think so?" he asked and pushed a piece of shrimp around his plate. "I don't want him to be weirded out." "Bruh." Daichi looked up at Tanaka, who had thrown his head back with a sigh. "Listen, if you ask him out and he says no, what's the worst thing that could happen?" "Are we forgetting I just spent a year with zero contact? Pretty sure him not wanting to talk to me again is the worst thing that can happen." Daichi shook his head. He doubted Suga would take it that far, but the possibility of it happening made him shiver a little. "Nah." Tanaka waved his hand in dismissal and made a pfft sound. "I'm pretty sure you guys have been in love with each other since high school. You'll be fine." Daichi made a non-committal noise and ate another piece of shrimp. "Guess we'll see," he said, covering his mouth as he spoke, so he wasn't showing Kyoko his chewed-up food. "I think it'll go well," she commented and took a sip from her glass. Hearing it from Kyoko was a lot more reassuring than either Tanaka or Iwaizumi. The sky outside hung heavy and dark with clouds full of rain. The weather seemed to walk the line between hot and sunny to cold and wet, like someone flicking on and off a light switch. It made it seem like time was going a lot faster than it was. Running his hand through his short, cropped hair, Daichi pulled into the parking lot of Suga's elementary school, watching out for him as he parked in a free space. Thankfully, most of the spaces were free, considering it was an hour and a bit after school had ended, and presumably all of the students had gone home. He watched the front door, waiting for Suga to come out. He planned on picking him and Iwaizumi up, and then going back to the sports center to find Terashima. Hopefully they would finally make significant progress. He was counting on it. Terashima and Oikawa seemed to have been close during the time Oikawa had first gone missing, if Higashiyama was to be believed. Daichi briefly wondered if the police had spoken to Terashima 5 years ago too, because it seemed like every person they had talked to had mentioned the fact that the police had come by when the case was fresh, but Oikawa was still missing. The thought made a hole open in Daichi's chest. As horrible as it was, he wasn't sure which was worse. That the police could be covering up what happened to Oikawa, or that Oikawa hadn't been found at all, that he was dead somewhere and nobody knew. He clenched the steering wheel with both hands and sat up stick straight. He didn't like thinking about Oikawa like that, but unfortunately for him, the image painted itself so clearly in Daichi's mind. When he was a child, he'd gone to his grandmother's wake, and he could remember how cold her hands had been when he decided to be brave and touch her. She hadn't even felt human. When he held her hand just a little bit tighter, it had reminded him of the big plastic bag of air-dry clay his teacher had asked him to help carry into their classroom during art. Heavy, squishy, and not alive. He could imagine Oikawa like that, his pale skin cold to the touch, in the way that it might be mistaken for damp instead, his face malleable, the way the smell of death would linger around him. "Fuck," he muttered to himself, and physically shook his thoughts from his head. It made Daichi uncomfortable just thinking about it, disturbed by the image his own mind had created. He took his hands off the wheel and rubbed up and down his arms, trying to get rid of the goosebumps. The door to the school opening caught Daichi's attention, and his breath stuttered a little in his throat when Suga walked out with a stack of books and papers perched on his hip like he was carrying a small child. He turned around and Daichi watched him look back through the doorway with a laugh. His eyes crinkled shut because of how wide he was smiling, and he hoisted the stack of books higher on his hip as he held the door open for the person he was talking to. Daichi was surprised when a child ducked under Suga's arm. What surprised him even more was the child's face, because that was Oikawa, only scaled down a few sizes, with wavy chestnut brown hair and a tall and spindly frame. But there was no doubt that he had the potential for muscular limbs made for jumping. Suga caught his eye, and he waved, clutching the books a little bit tighter. He leaned down to say something to the boy, Kaito most likely. Daichi would eat his own shoes if that wasn't him, and pointed. Kaito looked around the parking lot and then nodded with a shrug. Daichi lifted his hand up a little to wave back. Suga placed his free hand on Kaito's hair and guided him towards Daichi's car. "Hey," he said when Daichi opened the door and stepped out. "This is Kaito." Kaito looked up at him with a small, polite smile. "Hey," he parroted. "I'm Kaito." Daichi could only stare for a little bit. He looked so much like Oikawa, it was a little scary. "I'm Samura Daichi." He stuck his hand out for Kaito to shake, and the boy took it a little cautiously. "You've got a firm handshake, Kaito. That means you're really strong," he said, even though Kaito had barely even grasped his hand. Kaito's face lit up with pride, and Daichi laughed a little. Something about telling kids how strong they were always broke the ice a little. It was a tactic Daichi used whenever kids lost their parents out in public, and it almost always worked. "We're just waiting for Kaito's parents, and then you and I can go pick up a Waizumi," Suga explained with a tired sigh. He wrapped both arms around the books like they were weighing him down. "You know Hajime-sensei?" Kaito cocked his head to the side. Daichi watched Suga swallow nervously. He clearly hadn't told Kaito about their investigation, which made sense. There was no reason to get the boy's hopes up. "We played volleyball against a Waizumi when we were in school," Daichi explained with a smile. Kaito nodded sagely, like Daichi had just given him the secrets of the universe. "So you knew Uncle Toru too?" "A little," Daichi said with a shrug. Suga coughed loudly. "Kaito, your mum just pulled in." He pointed out a navy car that had just parked. "Let's go!" He handed the books to Daichi and walked Kaito over to the car. Daichi dipped his head back into his own car, dropped the books onto the passenger seat, and waited for Suga to get back. It was only a moment later that Suga was jogging back to him with another small wave. "You looked nervous," Daichi commented and got back into the car. "I know." Suga circled around the front and opened the passenger side door. "Whenever he brings up Oikawa, I feel so guilty. Like I'm hiding something from him." He picked up the books and threw them into the back seat, then sat down and placed his hand on his forehead, closing his eyes tightly. "I don't want to make him more upset if we don't find him." "Understandable." Daichi pulled his seatbelt over his chest. "Oh, by the way, Kyoko and Tanaka were asking for you." Suga opened his eyes again. "You guys talk about me?" Daichi thought back to their conversation from the night before, Tanaka urging him to ask Suga out, and Kyoko agreeing. "Yeah," he said. "They miss you." "You're looking a little red, Dai." Suga poked him in the side of the ribs. "Hope you guys aren't saying anything bad about me." "Course not." Daichi started up the car and pulled out of his parking space. "I would never tell them how you dragged me out of bed at 5 in the morning and held me at gunpoint until I made you coffee. How dare you accuse me of such a thing?" Suga clicked his tongue and shook his head. And the slander continues, Sawamura Daichi. You've made a habit of dragging my name through the mud, and I don't appreciate it.
Daichi laughed. Oops, he said with a shrug. My bad, guess I remembered it differently.
Cheeky. Suga poked him again and looked out the passenger window. I'm curious to know what Terashima will tell us. The sudden mood shift should have been more jarring, but Daichi couldn't help wondering the same thing. Terashima had been pretty easygoing in high school. He mostly remembered him for his tongue piercing and how uncomfortable he had made Kyoko. Hope he actually tells us something important. He could see Suga nodding from the corner of his eye. Same, he agreed, and the sounds of the rain slowly beginning to fall against the windscreen lulled them both into silence. Terashima Yuji hopped over the biggest fucking puddle he'd ever seen. God, this place does nothing to keep out the rain, he said, and maneuvered his way to the only patch of dry concrete in the sports center. Yeah, try living here. Oikawa pulled his jacket tighter around himself and pushed off the wall he'd been leaning on. You got it?
Course I do.
He pushed off the straps of his backpack and put it on the floor in front of him. Crouching down, he unzipped it. This is the brand I use, so it has the UG guarantee. He pulled out his spare hoodie, threw it to Oikawa and reached into the depth of his backpack, taking out all of the necessities as he went. He stood up again after finally retrieving the cardboard box. He then threw it a few centimeters into the air and caught it with a smile. This stuff will change your life. Oikawa glared at him and snatched the box out of his hand. It's just bleach. It's not like I'm getting a face tattoo or something. Higashiyama laughed from the corner he was sitting in. Honestly, Teru, with how fucking brassy your hair is, I'd be worried his hair will fall out. Oikawa's hand shot up into his hair, and he gripped it tightly. If my hair falls out, I'm never speaking to you again. Terashima took the box back from Oikawa and opened it up. Don't mind Higashi. He took out the sachet of powder and threw aside the instructions. Your hair's much healthier than mine. If mine hasn't fallen out yet, I doubt yours will. Oikawa massaged his scalp with a pout before shoving his hand into his jacket pocket and taking out some cash. For the bleach, he explained. Terashima looked at it in surprise. Damn, where'd you get this? Oikawa took off his jacket and averted his eyes. Same place I always get it. He put on Terashima's spare hoodie. Let's not talk about it. Fuck, Oikawa. Terashima put his backpack onto the stack of damp cinder blocks in front of them, and then pushed Oikawa down to sit on top of it. You know, I can give you help if you really need it. You don't have to do all that gross shit if you don't want to. Oikawa huffed out a breath and took the bottle of developer from the box. Obviously, I don't want to do that stuff, but I can't get a job. I'm supposed to be missing Terashima. Or did you miraculously forget that the police came by last week looking for me? Terashima handed him the bleach powder. Mix those together, would you? He said and pocketed the cash Oikawa had given him. And no, I didn't forget. But it's all good now though, right? They're staying out of your business. Oikawa poured the powder into the bottle and began to shake it with aggression Terashima hadn't seen before. Is doing that even legal? Higashiyama asked from his corner. You could probably send the police to whoever the fuck is paying you to do it, and they'll be too busy to be bothering you. You'd be off scot-free. Oikawa shrugged. The police would be riding my dick even more than they already are if I went to them. He sighed and lifted the bleach up to the light to see if it was fully mixed. Since I'm the one taking the money. Terashima took the bottle from him and put on the plastic gloves that came with the box. You could always come do some jobs with me. I don't go often, but When I need a little extra pocket money, it doesn't hurt. Oikawa shot him a disappointed look. It was something that Terashima would expect from a father or an older brother. The one that screams, "I raised you better than this." "What?" Terashima asked. "Like how you acquire your money is saintly and pure." Oikawa lifted his right leg onto the cinder blocks and shuffled around on his arse so he was facing away from Terashima. "The difference is that I do my job to make sure I don't starve or freeze to death, and you do it because your mom doesn't give you enough pocket money, and I'm not helping people pump their bodies full of shit." He crossed his arms over his chest. "Now do my hair and shut up." Terashima poured a glob of the creamy mixture onto his hand and rubbed it into the ends of Oikawa's hair. "It's not like he's spoon-feeding people cocaine, Oikawa," Higashiyama argued. "He's more like a mailman. He's not forcing them to do anything. He's just giving them the opportunity to do something." Oikawa's hair jerked out of Terashima's bleach-covered hands as he turned to scowl at Higashiyama. "You two are supposed to be athletes. Don't you care about your health?" He gestured to the cigarette Higashiyama had tucked behind his ear. Terashima grabbed Oikawa by the hair and forced him to face the other way so he could continue working on the back of his head. "We're not planning on playing professionally after school, and I just pretend I'm giving people some protein pills. Makes me feel less guilty," he said and squeezed the bleach directly onto Oikawa's hair. "Yeah, no shit you're not playing professionally," he muttered back and then fell into a sad sort of silence, and then he stayed like that for the rest of the time Terashima worked on his hair. Oikawa's hair was longer than Terashima's, but it still didn't take very long to completely cover in bleach and wrap up in the shower cap he'd stolen from his mum's bathroom. "If you're really desperate for money, you could always leave," he suggested after adjusting the cap's elastic under Oikawa's hairline. "There's loads of people in Tokyo. Doubt anyone would recognize you. You could get a job there and not have to worry about being found." Oikawa pressed his lips together. "I was thinking about that too," he said. "I don't know. It's sort of a lot, you know." Terashima nodded. He agreed. "But hey, I'll give you my number before you leave. Give me a call 3 times a year and you'll be fine." "No doubt." Oikawa smiled tightly and lifted his head to scratch under the elastic of the shower cap. "Fuck, this is burning. How long do I have to leave this on for?" Terashima looked at the piece of paper with the instructions on it, disintegrating in a puddle at his feet. We'll eyeball it. It'll be fine." Higashiyama snorted to himself. "I hope your head is attractive as your face, Oikawa. 'Cause you're gonna be bald by the end of today." Oikawa glared at him again, and patted the shower cap lightly. He worried his bottom lip between his teeth. "If anything like that happens, I'm going to murder you." His hair didn't fall out, thankfully. It turned out a bit more yellow than Terashima was hoping for, but it was a passable job, although Terashima had the inkling that a bad hair day was the least of Oikawa's worries. The car ride was awkward on the way back from the sports center that evening. Terashima sat beside Iwaizumi in the back seat, chattering on about things Daichi had no interest in paying attention to, until they pulled up outside his apartment building. "I promised I wouldn't say anything," he said, his hand on the door handle. "But I haven't heard from Oikawa in a while, and I'm worried about him." Daichi's head snapped around so fast he felt it crack. "Yeah?" he urged Terashima to continue. He looked oddly conflicted, but his hand fell from the door handle. "Last I heard, he was living with some guy in Tokyo. A manga writer, maybe. I don't know. He paused, his eyebrows scrunched up, tight. "I think his name was Akashi? Akashi something?" The crease between Iwaizumi's eyebrows deepened. "Helpful," he said. "Akashi Keiji." Suga looked at Hiroshima between the gap of the two front seats. "I'm pretty sure he's an editor for shonen manga. And he lives in Tokyo."
What are the odds that Oikawa's living with some guy we went to a training camp with in high school?
Daichi asked, because he wasn't even sure if Oikawa and Akashi Keiji had ever met before. "No, I think that's him," Hiroshima nodded. "Yeah, Akashi Keiji. But anyway, thanks for the ride, good luck!" Before any of them could ask any more questions, Hiroshima had opened the door and bolted out of the car, trying to avoid the rain as he ran to the apartment building across the street. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. Although this chapter wasn't angsty in the usual sense of the word, it still filled me with sadness for Oikawa. I feel privileged to be able to read this fanfiction. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, Aurorian on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload, but there is no pressure to do so. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!